Hello, I'm Mr. Brasher, and today I want to talk about some of the big ideas from earliest American history, the unit I call Unit A, Pre-Columbian and Colonial periods. Now, Pre-Columbian means before Columbus, so this is mostly Native Americans we're talking about, but also Europeans as they explored overseas before Columbus reached America and started European colonization. We call that the colonial period. And I want to share these big ideas using what I call a flowchart. Flowcharts are typically used in science or in operational activities to show how choices are made or problems are solved, but I think they can also serve well in history to show connections, causes, and effects. And so that's the point of this flowchart. You're welcome to draw along with me as you follow the video. Set up your paper like I've done here. I've also got a printable version on the class website. I'm also going to be using some colored pens. Sometimes some color can help you organize and make it look better. I want to start with the Ice Age, approximately 33,000 BCE. In simpler terms, thousands of years ago. That's where American human history begins, because from the Ice Age, and then here's a blank we're going to fill in, that created the Bering Land Bridge. So I'm going to write that in, and pardon my handwriting. I try to go slow and neat and careful, but it doesn't always work. That's important because across that Bering Land Bridge came Asian peoples or Siberian peoples in the Stone Age period. These are hunter-gatherers who probably followed game across the Bering Land Bridge to come to America. But there's more and more research coming out that some of these hunter-gatherers probably also came across in boats. This is a new addition to my flowchart. That's why it doesn't fit that great. But I put and or boats too. So it wasn't just the land bridge. Some of them may have come on boats, probably hugging the shoreline of modern-day Alaska coming to America. These Asian migrants, when they came to America, whether across the land bridge or in boats, they did three big actions that historically transforms them from Asian hunter-gatherer migrants into what we call Native Americans. And we're going to put those in this blank here. The first is simply they spread across the Americas. From Alaska all the way to the tip of South America. As they did so, here's our second blank here, they adapted and adjusted a variety of environments. And our third blank here, they developed agriculture. Especially that very important Native American crop of maize. These three big ideas together, occurring over thousands of years, eventually transforms these people into what we call Native Americans. There are hundreds of Native American groups all across the Americas with very different characteristics. But in our class, we talked about different illustrative examples that adapted to different regions. And so I put a little note here. This Native American from the John White watercolor is saying, see our previous map for illustrative examples. So go back to that map we already did previously to study those illustrative examples of Native Americans. But I'm also going to make this guy saying, don't forget 1491 as that symbolic year that we use to represent pre-Columbian Native American societies. Now we're going to shift to Europeans pre-Columbian. And I'm going to shift colors. So another big idea we learned about was European exploration overseas. But there's two big ideas we need to know that caused or led to this exploration. One is, what was the motive? Why were they doing this? So I'm going to write a desire for easier Asian trade. Remember, they're looking for an easier way to get to the resources and the products of what they called the Indies. Today we call Southeast Asia. But then another idea is, how were they able to explore overseas better? And so we talked about they used better sailing technology. That enabled them to explore more overseas. And this general idea of European exploration overseas, looking for better Asian trade and using better technology, leads to one of the most important events in American history, if not world history, and that is in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue and reached America. Now that's a lot to say. Let's shorten it a little bit. So I wrote, Columbus discovers America in 1492. Notice I put discovers in quotation marks because, as you know, Native Americans were here for thousands of years before Columbus, so technically they discovered it. And if you're thinking of European discovery, the Norse people discovered Canada, the northern part of North America, some 500 years earlier. So be aware of that loaded word discovery. But Columbus is definitely important because it is his discovery that leads to widespread European colonization of the Americas, a huge change in America. And we'll draw just a simple arrow here to this little map showing what that colonization looked like geographically. And over here on the right, we're going to talk about some specifics of the different European countries and their colonization. But for now, I want to show some changes and some interactions and some concepts between this colonization and the Native Americans. I'm going to shift colors for that. Most importantly, the big idea here is the Columbian Exchange. We talked a lot about that. I'm drawing an arrow from the Native Americans and an arrow from colonization and an arrow from Columbus himself. So when Columbus and the Europeans reach America, they exchange goods, ideas, germs, products, tools with the Native Americans, and the Native Americans do the same thing, exchanging with the Europeans, and that affects both groups of people. This next idea is very similar, but I want to make sure I specifically noted it. I want you to know about native adaptations to European culture. We talked about that too. So Native American groups change and adjust to European culture, those that remained after the Columbian Exchange. But in general, this is a tragic time for many Native American groups because of the Columbian Exchange and because of colonization. Natives generally are defeated, displaced, and die because of European colonization. Now let's talk about these specific examples of European colonization. I'm going to change colors again. The first Europeans we learned about, for whom Columbus sailed, is the Spanish. So even though Columbus is Italian, he sailed for the Spanish, funded by the Spanish. And they're famously interested in the 3 G's of God, gold, and glory. And I want to remind you of that year they began, 1492. It's an important year to remember. And we learned some about Spanish colonization, which as a whole we title New Spain, stretching from modern-day Florida and New Mexico, Arizona, California, and then generally southward from there, including the Caribbean, Central America, and a lot of South America. We often refer to that generally as Latin America. So you should know characteristics of New Spain. Then we briefly learned about the next big European colonization effort, the French, starting in 1608. And just like the Spanish, we generally call them, or their colonies, New France. So that starts up in Quebec City in eastern Canada and continues into Canada down towards the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River Valley, and some in the Caribbean. But they're mostly interested in wealth, especially the fur trade. And that's true of all colonization. Let's go back to the main point of colonization is for a mother country, so a powerful nation state, in this case in Europe, to send their people to another land to create a settlement, but the main priority is to send back wealth to the mother country. In some cases, it's literally gold, like the Spanish. But with the French, they found another way to get wealth, especially through the fur trade. And I also want to point out that if you look on a map, even though New France spreads from Canada down into the Mississippi River Valley, it looks like a massive chunk of land that they claimed, but it was a very scattered and not densely populated colonization. It's mostly a lot of fur traders, forts, some towns, some farms, but not densely populated like the Spanish or the English. But the group we looked at the most were the English. So let me change colors for the English. And you can also use the term British. Starting with Jamestown in 1607. They're also interested in wealth through colonization. Remember, the first colony of Jamestown was a joint stock company trying to get wealth. But also there's a lot of unemployed people who are looking for new opportunities, and so they're interested in traveling to a new land. And there are some religious dissidents who are unhappy with the religious situation in England at the time and are willing to travel to a new land for more religious freedom. So it depends on the particular colony and the particular group of people what they were primarily motivated by. So be aware of that. And because the English colonies do the most to form the future United States, we focus most of our studies of colonization on the English colonies. And historians divide those up into regions. So it's not just New Britain or New England. There are several regions that we learned about. But let's start with that one of New England. Don't be confused. New England does not refer to all of the English colonies like New France does or New Spain does. This typically, not typically, this only refers to those northern colonies, starting with Plymouth in Massachusetts, and think of the northeast United States up here. There's New England. Traveling geographically southward, we also learned about the mid-Atlantic colonies. We often think of those as the North today, but back then they were considered the middle colonies, or mid-Atlantic. So think of Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey. Don't forget, I'll change colors for a second. There was some other European influence on the mid-Atlantic, especially the Dutch. New York used to be New Netherlands. Traveling further south, we learned about the Chesapeake colonies. That's where Jamestown was, which eventually became Virginia, but also includes Maryland, sometimes Delaware, sometimes North Carolina, near that Chesapeake Bay. Continuing further south, sometimes these colonies are called the Far South or the Lower South, including the Caribbean, aka the West Indies. I want to make sure you know all these terms because it can be confusing sometimes when they use different terminology, but it basically means the same thing. So this would be South Carolina, Georgia, and those Caribbean colonies. I'm going to add one more note here. We did a map of this too. So I'm going to write, see our colonial map. Okay, so hopefully now you've got the big ideas of what happened in Unit A, the development of Native Americans, the arrival of Europeans, that began colonization, how colonization and Native Americans interacted and adjusted, and then some specific comparisons between the different European colonization efforts, Spanish, French, English, and other Europeans. After this unit, we will talk about how Unit A transitions into Unit B, the American Revolutionary period. And remember, these are just the big ideas. You need to go to your study guide and go back to your notes and go back to your textbook for the specifics. But start here to get the big ideas and then dive deeper into the details in those other resources. Thanks for tuning in.